The sun hung low over Copper Creek, casting long shadows across the dusty main street as Thomas McKenna rode into town. The leather of his saddle creaked with each step of his chestnut mare, and his weathered hands gripped the reins with a tension that had nothing to do with controlling his horse. 3 months had passed since he'd received the telegram that changed everything. 3 months since he'd learned that the 2 women who had saved his life were now prisoners in this God-forsaken settlement. Thomas had been tracking rumors and following whispers across half of Arizona territory, chasing down leads that had taken him from mining camps to trading posts, from saloons to missionary schools. Each dead end had only fueled his determination. Now, as he surveyed the ramshackle buildings of Copper Creek, he knew his search was finally over. The town was little more than a collection of wooden structures thrown together around a single dirt road, the kind of place that attracted men running from their past and others looking to profit from human misery. At the far end of the street stood a large wooden platform, hastily constructed and surrounded by a crowd of rough-looking men. Thomas felt his jaw clench as he recognized what he was seeing. He dismounted and tied his horse to a hitching post, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the ground. The sound of voices carried on the desert wind, and Thomas could make out the auctioneer's practiced cadence even from a distance. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip, checking that it sat loose in its holster. As he approached the crowd, Thomas pulled his hat down low over his eyes and tried to blend in with the other spectators. The men around him were a mix of prospectors, drifters, and worse, their faces bearing the hard lines that came from lives lived on the wrong side of the law. They pressed forward eagerly, their attention fixed on the platform, where a man in a dirty suit was conducting his vile business. Thomas's heart nearly stopped when he saw them. There, standing on the wooden platform with their hands bound, were Ayanna and Itzel, the 2 Apache women who had pulled him back from death's door during the worst winter of his life. Even in their current circumstances, they stood with a dignity and strength that made Thomas's chest tighten with admiration and rage. Ayanna, the elder of the 2 at perhaps 25 years, had raven black hair that fell past her shoulders, despite the rough treatment she had clearly endured. Her dark eyes swept the crowd with a mixture of defiance and calculation, as if she were memorizing every face for future reckoning. Beside her stood Itzel, younger but no less formidable, her chin raised in proud resistance, despite the fear Thomas could see flickering in her expression. The auctioneer, a sweaty man with tobacco-stained teeth, was in the middle of his pitch when Thomas pushed through the crowd to get closer. "Now, gentlemen, you won't find finer specimens than these 2 beauties. Strong as horses, these Apache women. And look at those fine features. Bidding starts at $50 for the pair." Thomas felt bile rise in his throat. The casual way the man spoke about human beings as property made his trigger finger itch, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had to be smart about this. There were at least 30 men in the crowd, and while Thomas was handy with a gun, those weren't odds he could fight his way through. $60, called out a voice from the crowd, and Thomas turned to see a heavy-set man in the expensive coat raising his hand. The man's face bore the soft look of someone who had never done an honest day's work, and the way his eyes lingered on the women made Thomas's skin crawl. 65, came another bid, this one from a group of miners who had clearly been drinking. They laughed among themselves, making comments that Thomas chose not to hear clearly. As the bidding continued to climb, Thomas found himself studying the layout of the town, looking for escape routes and counting the number of armed men he could see. The platform backed up against the rear of the general store, which meant limited options for a quick exit. There were horses tied to hitching posts throughout the area, but most looked like they belonged to the bidders themselves. $100, shouted the heavy-set man, and a murmur of approval went through the crowd. The auctioneer smiled widely, sensing that the bidding was reaching its peak. $100 going once, the auctioneer called out, raising his gavel. These fine specimens will make excellent additions to any household or business venture. Going twice. Thomas knew this was his moment. He stepped forward, pushing through the crowd until he stood at the front, his presence commanding attention. "Hold on there, friend," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled men. "I'm afraid there's been a mistake." The auctioneer paused, his gavel halfway to the wooden block. "What kind of mistake, stranger? This is a legal auction, all proper-like." Thomas allowed himself a cold smile. "Legal? That's interesting, seeing as how these two women are already spoken for." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it up for all to see. "I have here a bill of sale dated 3 months ago, showing that these two were purchased legally from a trader in Tucson." The crowd began to murmur, and Thomas could see confusion spreading among the bidders. The heavy-set man who had been bidding stepped forward, his face red with anger. "That's impossible. I have it on good authority that these two were captured just last week." "Then someone's been feeding you false information," Thomas replied smoothly. He unfolded the paper, which was actually a deed to some worthless land he owned, but in the fading light and at a distance it looked official enough. "As you can see, the transaction was recorded with the territorial authority. These women belong to me." Ayana and Itzel had both turned to stare at him, and Thomas could see the recognition dawning in their eyes. Ayana's expression shifted from confusion to something that might have been hope, while Itzel's eyes narrowed as she tried to understand what game he was playing. The auctioneer squinted at the paper from his position on the platform. "Let me see that document, mister. I need to verify its authenticity." "Of course," Thomas said, but instead of handing over the paper, he stepped up onto the platform. "But I'm afraid I can't let it out of my possession. Too many dishonest folks around these days." As he moved closer to the auctioneer, his hand moved to rest casually on his gun butt. The crowd was growing restless, and several men were shouting their displeasure at this interruption to their entertainment. Thomas could feel the tension building like a thunderstorm on the horizon, and he knew he had only moments before the situation exploded into violence. "This is highly irregular," the auctioneer protested, but Thomas could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The man was clearly more comfortable dealing with defenseless captives than with an armed cowboy who knew how to carry himself. "What's irregular," Thomas said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, "is conducting an auction for stolen property. Now, I suggest you release these women to their rightful owner before this becomes a matter for the territorial marshal." The mention of law enforcement sent another ripple through the crowd. Most of the men gathered here were wanted for various crimes, and the last thing they wanted was official attention. Thomas could see several of them already beginning to drift away from the platform, but the heavy-set man wasn't giving up so easily. "This is nonsense," he declared, pushing his way toward the platform. "I don't believe this stranger for a minute. Where were these women for the past 3 months if he owned them? Why didn't he come forward before now?" Thomas had been hoping to avoid this question, but he was ready with an answer. "They were working at my ranch, up in the Mogollon Mountains. I only learned they'd been taken when I came down to Prescott for supplies and found my place ransacked." He fixed the heavy-set man with a steady stare. "The question is, friend, how did you know they'd be here today? Seems like you might have been involved in taking them from my property in the first place." This accusation sent a shock through the crowd, and Thomas saw several hands move toward gun butts. The heavy-set man's face went from red to purple, and he spluttered incoherently for a moment before finding his voice. "That's slander, you son of a—" "Careful now," Thomas interrupted, his own hand now resting openly on his Colt. "Wouldn't want to say something you might regret." The auctioneer, sensing that his profitable enterprise was about to turn into a bloodbath, tried to regain control of the situation. "Gentlemen, please, let's all remain calm. Perhaps we could examine this bill of sale more carefully in better light and—" "There's nothing to examine," Thomas said firmly. He turned to address Ayana and Itzel directly, switching to the Apache language he had learned during his time with their people. "Do you trust me?" he asked in their tongue. Ayana's response came without hesitation. "With our lives, Thomas McKenna, as you trusted us with yours." The sound of the Apache language being spoken sent another ripple through the crowd, and Thomas knew he was running out of time. Some of these men would recognize it and realize that he had a personal connection to the women, which would undermine his story about purchasing them legally. "Cut their bonds," Thomas ordered the auctioneer, his hand now gripping his gun handle. "Now." "I don't think that's wise," the heavy-set man said, and Thomas saw that he too had drawn his weapon, a nickel-plated revolver that looked expensive but probably hadn't seen much use. "I think this stranger is running some kind of confidence game, and I for one am not going to stand for it." The platform had become the center of a tense standoff, with Thomas on one side and the heavy-set man on the other. While the auctioneer cowered between them, the crowd had formed a loose circle around the base of the platform, some men eager to see blood spilled, while others looked ready to bolt at the first sign of gunfire. Thomas knew that once the shooting started, it would be nearly impossible to get Ayana and Itzel to safety. He needed to find another way to defuse the situation, or at least create enough confusion to give them a fighting chance. "You know what I think?" Thomas said, addressing the crowd rather than his immediate opponent. "I think some of you boys have been taken for fools. This whole auction is probably a setup designed to separate you from your hard-earned money." He gestured toward the auctioneer. "How do you know this man has any right to sell these women? Where did he get them? Who's backing his operation?" These questions struck home with several members of the crowd, and Thomas could see doubt beginning to spread among them. Men who made their living on the wrong side of the law were naturally suspicious, and it didn't take much to turn that suspicion on each other. "He's got a point," called out one of the miners. "We don't know nothing about this fellow, and $100 is a lot of money to throw around on his say-so." "Shut up, Jake," another man hissed. "Don't listen to this stranger. He's just trying to cheat us out of our prize." But the seed of doubt had been planted, and Thomas pressed his advantage. "I'll tell you what, gentlemen. Since there seems to be some question about the legitimacy of this auction, why don't we all ride over to Fort Apache and let the army sort this out? I'm sure the commanding officer would be very interested to hear how these women ended up on an auction block." The mention of the army had an immediate effect on the crowd. Several more men began to drift away, unwilling to risk military attention to their activities. Even the heavy-set man looked less certain of his position. But the auctioneer wasn't ready to give up his payday without a fight. "Now hold on just a minute," he protested. "This is a legitimate business transaction. These women were sold to me fair and square by a licensed trader out of New Mexico territory. I have all the proper paperwork." "Then you won't mind showing it to the army," Thomas replied smoothly. "In fact, why don't we send someone to fetch them right now? I'm sure they could be here by morning." This suggestion caused an immediate panic among what remained of the crowd. Men began scattering in all directions, mounting their horses and riding out of town as fast as their animals could carry them. Within minutes, only a handful of the most determined bidders remained, along with the heavy-set man and a few others who looked like they might be part of the auctioneers' organization. Thomas could see that Ayana and Itzel were watching the proceedings with growing hope, but they remained alert and ready to act if the situation deteriorated further. Their hands were still bound, but Thomas knew from experience that both women were formidable fighters, even under such constraints. "Seems like your audience is losing interest," Thomas observed to the auctioneer. "Maybe it's time to call off this whole charade and let these women go." "Over my dead body," the heavy-set man snarled, and Thomas saw that several other men had now drawn their weapons as well. "I've come too far and spent too much money tracking down these two to let some drifter waltz in here and steal them out from under me." Thomas felt a chill as he realized the true nature of what he was facing. This wasn't just a random auction of captured women, it was a targeted operation designed specifically to acquire Ayana and Itzel. Someone had gone to considerable trouble and expense to arrange this, which meant they had reasons beyond simple profit. "Who are you?" Thomas asked the heavy-set man directly. "What do you want with these women?" The man's smile was cold and predatory. "Let's just say they have information that certain parties are very interested in obtaining. Information about Apache strongholds, about tribal movements, about things that could be very valuable to the right buyers." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. He had heard rumors of men who specialized in extracting intelligence from captured Native Americans, using methods that made honest torture seem merciful by comparison. The thought of Ayana and Itzel in the hands of such people filled him with a rage that threatened to overwhelm his careful planning. "That's not going to happen," Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet. "These women are under my protection, and I'll kill any man who tries to harm them." The heavy-set man laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin can. "You're outnumbered 5-1, stranger. Even if you're fast with that iron, you can't take us all. Why don't you just ride away while you still can, and we'll forget this unfortunate interruption ever happened." Thomas glanced around at the remaining men, calculating odds and distances. The heavy-set man was right about the numbers, but Thomas had advantages they didn't know about. He had fought alongside Ayana and Itzel before, and he knew exactly what they were capable of when their lives were on the line. "I've got a better idea," Thomas said, and his hand moved to his gun with practiced speed. The Colt cleared leather in a smooth motion that spoke of years of practice and several life-or-death encounters. "Why don't you all drop your weapons and ride out of here while you still can?" For a moment, time seemed frozen on the platform. Thomas stood with his gun trained on the heavy-set man, while 5 other weapons pointed back at him. The auctioneer had dropped to his knees behind a wooden crate, trying to make himself as small a target as possible. It was Ayana who broke the stalemate. Despite her bound hands, she managed to hook her leg around the auctioneer's ankle and send him sprawling. At the same moment, Itzel threw herself sideways, rolling off the platform and creating chaos among the men below. Thomas used the distraction to put a bullet through the heavy-set man's gun hand, sending his nickel-plated revolver spinning away across the wooden planks. The man screamed and clutched his wounded hand to his chest, blood seeping between his fingers. The other men opened fire immediately, but Thomas had already dropped to one knee behind a wooden post that supported the platform's roof. Splinters of wood exploded around him as bullets struck the timber, but the thick beam provided enough cover for him to return fire. His second shot took down one of the gunmen, a thin man with a scarred face who had been trying to circle around for a better angle. The man dropped his weapon and fell backward into the dust, clutching his shoulder and cursing loudly. Meanwhile, Itzel had managed to work her way behind the remaining attackers, and despite her bound hands, she kicked the legs out from under one of them just as he was taking aim at Thomas. The man went down hard, his shot going wild and punching a hole through the roof of the general store. Ayana had also freed herself from the platform and was using her bound hands as a club, striking at anyone who came within reach. Her movements were fluid and precise, the result of years of training in combat techniques that few white men had ever witnessed. Thomas put another bullet into the leg of a man who was trying to reload behind a water trough, sending him hopping away on one foot while howling in pain. That left only 2 gunmen still actively fighting, plus the wounded heavy-set man who was trying to retrieve his weapon with his good hand. "Give it up," Thomas called out, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of gunfire. "Your boss is down, half your men are wounded, and you're surrounded. Drop your weapons and you can ride out of here." One of the remaining gunmen, a young man who looked like he was barely out of his teens, threw down his pistol immediately. "I'm done," he called out, raising his hands. "This wasn't supposed to turn into a war." But the last gunman, a grizzled veteran with the look of an old cavalry soldier, wasn't ready to surrender. He had taken cover behind a horse trough and was methodically working his way closer to the platform, using his military training to advance under fire. Thomas recognized the man's tactics and knew he was dealing with someone who had seen real combat. This wouldn't be resolved with intimidation or lucky shots. It would require skill and determination. The old soldier made his move, rising from cover with his gun already aimed at Thomas's position. But Thomas had been watching for exactly this moment, and his return shot was faster and more accurate. The bullet took the man in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him face first into the dirt. Suddenly, the street was quiet except for the groans of wounded men and the sound of horses stamping nervously at their hitching posts. The heavy-set man was still on his knees on the platform, holding his wounded hand and staring at Thomas with a mixture of pain and hatred. "This isn't over, stranger," the man gasped. "There are others who want these women, others with more resources than you can imagine. They'll find you wherever you go." Thomas kept his gun trained on the man while he moved to help Ayana and Itzel. Using his knife, he quickly cut the ropes binding their hands, watching as they rubbed circulation back into their wrists. "Are you hurt?" he asked them in Apache, and both women shook their heads. "We are unharmed," Ayana replied, "but we cannot stay here. This man speaks the truth. There are others who seek us, and they will not give up easily." Thomas nodded, understanding the implications. Whatever had made these women valuable enough to justify an elaborate capture and auction operation wasn't going to disappear just because he had disrupted their plans. "We need horses and supplies," he said, switching back to English for the benefit of any listening ears. "And we need to put some distance between ourselves and this place before reinforcements arrive." The wounded, heavy-set man laughed bitterly. "You think you can just ride away from this? You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into, cowboy. These women are wanted by people who don't accept failure lightly." "Then those people are going to be disappointed," Thomas replied. He gestured toward the horses tied up around the street. "I suggest you and your remaining boys patch yourselves up and find somewhere else to be. If I see any of you following us, I won't be as generous with my shooting next time." The young gunman who had surrendered helped his wounded companions to their feet, and the group began making their way toward their horses. The heavy-set man needed assistance mounting his animal, but he managed to pull himself into the saddle despite his injured hand. Before riding away, he turned back to face Thomas one more time. "Mark my words, stranger. This bounty on their heads won't disappear just because you played hero today. Sooner or later, someone will collect it, and when they do, you'll wish you had minded your own business." Thomas watched until the group had ridden out of sight, before turning his attention to gathering supplies for their escape. He ransacked the general store, taking ammunition, food, and blankets, while leaving money on the counter to pay for what he took. Ayana and Itzel helped him select horses from those abandoned by fleeing auction-goers, choosing animals that looked strong and well-rested. As they prepared to leave Copper Creek, Thomas found himself remembering the events that had first brought these three together. It had been almost 2 years ago, during one of the worst winters in memory, when a blizzard had caught him in the high country of the Mogollon Mountains. He had been tracking a group of cattle rustlers when the storm hit, and within hours he was completely lost in a whiteout that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. His horse had stepped in a prairie dog hole and broken its leg, forcing Thomas to put the animal down and continue on foot through waist-deep snow. For 3 days, he had wandered through the wilderness, growing weaker with each passing hour as the cold sapped his strength and his meager supplies ran out. On the 4th day, when he was beginning to accept that he would die in those mountains, Ayana and Itzel had found him collapsed in a snowdrift, barely alive and incoherent with hypothermia. They had been hunting elk in the high country when they discovered his nearly frozen body, and without hesitation they had carried him to a sheltered cave and nursed him back to health. For 2 weeks they had cared for him, sharing their food and using their knowledge of traditional medicine to treat his frostbite and exposure injuries. When he had finally recovered enough to travel, they had guided him safely back to civilization. asking nothing in return except that he remember their kindness. Thomas had offered them money, supplies, anything he could think of to repay their generosity, but they had refused all payment except his promise to help other travelers in need whenever he encountered them. Now, as they rode out of Copper Creek under the cover of darkness, Thomas reflected on how that promise had come full circle. The women who had saved his life were now depending on him to save theirs, and he was determined not to let them down. They rode hard through the night, following game trails and dry creek beds to avoid leaving obvious tracks for anyone who might try to follow them. Ayana and Itzel proved to be excellent traveling companions, their knowledge of the desert terrain invaluable in helping them find water and shelter in the harsh landscape. By dawn, they had covered nearly 20 miles, and Thomas began to feel cautiously optimistic about their chances of escape. But as they stopped to rest their horses and share a cold breakfast, Ayana brought up the question that had been weighing on all their minds. "Thomas," she said, speaking in English so that all three could participate in the conversation, "we must speak of what comes next. The man you wounded spoke truly. There are others who seek us, and they will not stop because of what happened yesterday." Thomas nodded grimly. He had been hoping to avoid this conversation, but he knew it was necessary. "What exactly did you two do to attract this kind of attention? That auction wasn't random. Someone specifically wanted you captured alive." Itzel and Ayana exchanged glances before the younger woman spoke. 6 months ago, we witnessed something we should not have seen. White men meeting with renegade Apache, making plans for raids on settlements and wagon trains. But these were not ordinary raids. They were being organized by men in expensive clothes who spoke of profits and territories. "Government men?" Thomas asked, feeling a chill of premonition. "Some, perhaps," Ayana replied. "Others were civilians, men who spoke of railroad contracts and mining rights. They were using Apache raids as a way to drive settlers from valuable land, then moving in to claim it for themselves once the areas were declared too dangerous for habitation." Thomas let out a low whistle. What the women were describing was a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government and business. If such men were involved, it explained why the bounty on Ayana and Itzel was so high, and why professional killers had been hired to capture them alive. "Did you report what you saw to anyone?" he asked. "We tried," Itzel said bitterly. "We went to the Indian agent at the reservation, but he refused to listen. We tried to speak with the army commanders, but they said the word of 2 Apache women was not sufficient evidence. Some even suggested that we were part of the conspiracy ourselves." "So you went into hiding," Thomas concluded, and both women nodded. "We hoped that if we stayed away from the settlements, the danger would pass," Ayana explained. "But they found us anyway, and now we cannot return to our people without bringing this trouble upon them as well." Thomas studied the 2 women as they spoke, seeing not just their physical beauty, but the strength and intelligence that had made them such formidable allies during his ordeal in the mountains. These were not helpless victims. They were warriors who had been fighting a battle for justice against overwhelming odds. "What do you want to do?" he asked them directly. "You can't go back to the reservation, and you can't stay in Arizona territory as long as these men are hunting you. But you're not prisoners. You're free to make your own choices about what comes next." Ayana looked at her companion before answering. "We have discussed this during our captivity, and we have decided that running and hiding is not enough. These men will continue their evil work as long as they believe they can act without consequence. Someone must stop them." "And you think that someone should be us?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. "You have shown that you are willing to risk your life for what is right," Itzel said, "and we have information that could expose their entire operation if we can find someone in authority who is not part of their conspiracy." Thomas considered their words as he watched the sun climb higher in the eastern sky. What they were proposing was dangerous beyond measure, taking on a conspiracy that included government officials and wealthy businessmen would be like declaring war on the entire territorial establishment. But the alternative was allowing innocent people to be murdered for profit, while good people like Ayana and Itzel lived as fugitives. "There's a federal marshal in Tucson," Thomas said finally. "Marcus Wheeler. I served with him during the war, and he's as honest as they come. If anyone would listen to your story and act on it, it would be him." "Tucson is a long way from here," Ayana pointed out, "and these men will expect us to head for the larger towns where we might find help." "Then we don't go directly to Tucson," Thomas replied, a plan beginning to form in his mind. "We head east toward New Mexico territory, maybe even as far as Texas. Let them think we're running scared. Then, when they've given up looking for us in Arizona, we circle back and find Marshal Wheeler." The plan had merit, but it would mean weeks or months of dangerous travel through some of the most hostile territory in the Southwest. They would have to avoid not only the men hunting them, but also hostile Apache bands who might not distinguish between Thomas and their other white enemies. "It is a good plan," Itzel said after thinking it over. "But we cannot ask you to abandon your life for our cause. You have already done more than friendship demands." Thomas smiled, remembering the words Ayana had spoken to him during his recovery in their mountain cave. "You told me once that helping others in need wasn't a burden, it was a privilege. I reckon it's time I proved I was listening." They mounted their horses and continued their journey east, riding through country that grew more desolate with each passing mile. Thomas knew that they had a long road ahead of them, filled with dangers both human and natural. But for the first time since receiving that telegram 3 months ago, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond simple rescue. As they rode, Ayana moved her horse closer to his. "Thomas McKenna," she said formally, using his full name as she had during his recovery. "I speak for both Itzel and myself when I say that your courage honors the friendship between us. Whatever comes next, we will face it together, as we should have from the beginning." Thomas touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the desert sun. Behind them, Copper Creek was disappearing into the heat shimmer, taking with it the last remnants of their old lives. Ahead lay uncertainty and danger, but also the possibility of justice and redemption. They had a long way to go before their story would be finished, but Thomas McKenna was no longer riding alone. He had found his purpose, and more importantly, he had found his family. In a land where survival often meant choosing between right and wrong, they had chosen to stand together for what was right, regardless of the cost. The desert stretched endlessly before them, but they rode toward their uncertain future with the confidence of people who knew exactly who they were and what they stood for. And in the end, that was all any of them could ask for in this harsh but beautiful land they called home. If you enjoyed this tale of courage and friendship from the Old West, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more stories of adventure and honor from America's frontier days. Let us know in the comments what other Old West legends you'd like to hear about. Perhaps you have a family story passed down through generations, or maybe there's a particular aspect of frontier life that interests you. Your suggestions help us bring you the stories that matter most to you, so don't be shy about sharing your thoughts below.